For social studies today, you will have noticed there is a Word document linked up. It says Deerfield Response in the Google Classroom. You could print this out, or you could just write your answers on notebook paper. The first thing you're going to do is write a good summary of the important actions from the beginning, middle, and end of this story. So this is what we left off with yesterday. What story did connect these three artifacts? Today, you are specifically looking to find out the who attacked the who. So your first sentence in the answer will tell which group attacked which other group. And then you will say they took who to where. So you should already know that these three artifacts are connected because there's an attack and there's going to be some traveling. Then some of the captives will have one thing happen to them, and some of them will have a different event happen to them. That will be clear by the end. You also will need to answer what you think this event, the Deerfield Massacre, helps show about the interactions of the nations of England. So what does this show about England and France, how they got along? What about the Native American nations like the Iroquois? Were they always against the European nations, or did some of the Native American nations ally themselves with different European nations? And what was going on in the 1700s? And one good hint is the fact that this story is called the Deerfield Massacre. In order to get the information, what you might want to do is have this written off for yourself on paper, or keep it open in a separate tab while you are watching this video. In the meantime, I will go back and finish up showing you this connection between the door and the snowshoes. And now I'll tell you, this is just a child's shoe, in case you didn't infer that yesterday. What do you notice in this picture so far? This door should look familiar, along with the hole in it. Do you have some idea now how the hole got in the door, knowing that this is called the Deerfield Massacre? Oh, what does this Native American warrior have in his hand? Doesn't that look like a hatchet? Would that explain the hole? How it got made? Does this fellow putting his musket into the hole, does that explain why the hole might have been made? If this was called the Deerfield Massacre, where do you suppose this little cabin was? And now you get some things from this side of the picture. Remember, one of the artifacts was a child's shoe. Does it look like this is daytime or nighttime? What about this little baby girl? Look at the background now. Can you see perhaps where this little baby girl might have come from? What's going on back there? Who does it look like is winning in the Deerfield Massacre? Well, remember, we had France and England claiming land very close to one another up in the New England area. And the French made friends with the Iroquois tribe. In fact, they had been friends since the very first French explorers, Cartier and Champlain and so forth. Because the Iroquois were friends with the French, that meant that when the French wanted to attack an English settlement to dispute that area that both England and France claimed, the Iroquois were very often allies. What would happen? Well, couple of things. The settlement that was attacked would be destroyed as much as they could, and the people who were not killed were taken captive. Very often, the children were preferred. This is a reconstruction of what Deerfield would have looked like during the attack. You can see some of the houses got burned down, others escaped. And then you can also see there was a river along Deerfield, and this hill in the background we'll talk about in a moment. How were the attacking French and Iroquois able to get into this settlement? You can see there is a wall around it, right? A fence, a stockade. Well, that particular winter there was so much snow, and a lot of it came from one direction, that it piled up against the palisade, this fence. And using snowshoes, the Native Americans and the French were able to climb up over that snow. They, of course, took the snowshoes off because you can't fight very easily wearing snowshoes. Do you have an idea about the story that connects these three artifacts? People from which nation would have been wearing these snowshoes? This would represent the attack. Who would have been wearing this kind of shoe? Remember, your assignment at the end of this is to summarize this story. Can you say who attacked who? If you can't, go back and listen to the video again, or take a look at this next part. You should have some idea of the winners at this point. By the way, this next picture is taking place on this hill right here, about 1.5 miles outside of the town of Deerfield. And yes, I walked that distance several times. The hill is still there, and it's very visible because the land in between is very flat. What happened at that hill? Well, you can see these English shoes. It looks like they're being taken off and given to the Iroquois. These English people, these colonists from Deerfield, you can see one of them is looking backwards. So who did the attacking? Well, it was the Iroquois and the French soldiers. Who was attacked? The people who lived in the English settlement in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Who won? Well, look back. There is the burning town that these people have been forced to leave. How do you know they've been forced? Well, look it. The Iroquois are the only ones holding weapons, and the French, these English colonists, they're not holding weapons. They're doing what they were told to do. What do you notice this fellow is wearing? These people are changing. When the French and the Iroquois reached this hill before they went to attack Deerfield, they left all their supplies back on this hill. Those supplies included snowshoes that they had brought for the captives that they planned to take with them. What was done with the people who were captured in Deerfield? They were marched about 300 miles north to Canada. You should have some idea of the story that does connect these three artifacts. So Deerfield, on a map now, is right here. It's near Boston. And the survivors from Deerfield were marched north about 300 miles to Three Rivers. Over time, some of those survivors were sold to French people in Montreal. Other of those survivors were taken to the different Iroquois villages. Some were adopted into families, some were kept as slaves of the Iroquois. But the people who survived back in Deerfield didn't just forget about their family that had been taken in this attack. So the first thing, this is from a diary of one of the boys who was taken from Deerfield. I kept the spelling just as it is because, I mean, come on, look at the spellings, right? The next day, the day after they were taken, was a tempestuous day, and I froze my great toe of my left foot. The day after which my master, so this would be the Iroquois warrior who took Stephen Williams captive. He became Stephen's master. He bid me go down to the river with him very early in the morning, which startled me, for he did not used to be so early. There the river parted, and I went up one branch, my father with my brothers and sisters the other. So Stephen was going to live with his captor, the Iroquois that took him prisoner. Stephen's father and brothers and sisters were taken in a different direction. I never saw my father for 14 months after. This is the story of the Snowshoes. So the Snowshoes I've been showing you, they belonged to a fellow named John Sheldon. He was born in 1658. He died in 1733. He was from Deerfield, Massachusetts. He was sent 3 times by the governor of Massachusetts to New France to retrieve, to bring back the New England captives, some of whom were taken in the 1704 Deerfield raid. He made his first journey in the winter of 1705, his last in 1707. He brought back, he ransomed, he paid money for 100 captives in all. He may have used this pair of snowshoes. Rewind the video, go back to the beginning and look at them. Those snowshoes for his winter redemption missions when he went to take money to the Iroquois in New France to buy back these people who were taken out of their homes that night in February in Deerfield. And this is just a review about snowshoes were actually invented by the Native Americans. We read this yesterday. The march to Canada. The villagers who were captured in Deerfield were forced to march the 300-mile-long journey to Canada in the deep snow in the dead of winter. Those who could not keep up were killed. Chances of survival seemed to depend on the captive's gender, whether they were a boy or a girl, and age. Since infants and young children fared the worst, that means they most often were killed, more adult men survived than adult women, especially if the women were pregnant. They probably wouldn't have survived this 300-mile-long march. And the women who had young children, they would have been trying to protect their young children, and so they were quickly killed because it was most important to the Iroquois and the French who made this raid in 1706, I think it was. It was most important for them to travel as quickly as they could to get up to Canada, New France, where there were more French soldiers to allow them to keep their prisoners. In the first few days of the journey, several of the captives escaped. After de Rouville, I probably said that wrong, but he was the leader of the French soldiers, he told Reverend the minister Williams to tell the other captives that if anybody escaped and was recaptured, they would be tortured. So then, after they were told this, nobody else tried to escape. There were more than 100 people from Deerfield who were captured. Only 89 survived the 300-mile journey to Canada. After they reached Canada, the Indians sold a lot of those captives to the French. The French sold 60 of those Deerfield people back to the English over that 3-year period of time when John Sheldon wore his snowshoes to be buying them back. Many of the younger captives assimilated and were adopted into Indian tribes or French Canadian society. What does that mean? Well, 36 of those Deerfield captives who had been children or teenagers when the Iroquois and the French came and attacked Deerfield and took them away, kidnapped them, 36 of them stayed in Canada for the rest of their lives. They married into French or Indian families. So this gives you a bit of math now. 112 were captured, 21 died on the march, 5 escaped. By 1707, 47 had returned. By 1714, 8 more. So in total, 55 were returned. Later, 2 more. That makes 57. 19 stayed with the French. 7 stayed with the natives. 3 we don't know about. So if I go back to the very middle and have you look again, what is the story that connects these 3 artifacts? If you need to, in order to do this assignment, rewind this video. Who attacked who? With this story that we've been talking about these last 2 days. The people who attacked, they took captives, they took people. Where did they take them? In the end, some of those captives were, and some of them stayed. So again, go back into the video, rewind this just a smidgen to find these answers. This last part of the question, all right, what do you know about the way England and France and the Native American nations interacted with each other? England and France, disputed area. Native Americans lived in all this land. So what do you think this shows you about how those 3 groups interacted with each other in the 1700s? This should be at least 1 sentence. You should use the words interactions of the nations. You should use the word England, the word France. You could say Native Americans. You could just say Iroquois. It'd probably be best to say Native Americans. Should probably include the fact that we're talking about the 1700s. So it might take you more than 1 sentence to answer this question, possibly 2 or 3 sentences. This is your assignment for social studies today.